everybody, and welcome to EcoCanada's Environmental Insider webinar series. Today's webinar is called Archaeological Predictive Modelling, Applications of Machine Learning. Today's guest speaker, Reid Graham from Tree Time Services, is going to share all about how advances in machine learning and improvements to modelling techniques are helping us to identify and protect Canada's archaeological sites. My name is Hannah Williamson, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. I'm the Events and Training Coordinator for EcoCanada. Before we start, there's just a few housekeeping tips that I want to share with everybody on the line, and this just makes sure that everybody can enjoy and participate in the webinar effectively. All participants are muted, so please check your audio settings to ensure that you can hear us properly. If you're experiencing any technical issues today, please use the chat box or the question function and select Vanessa Morgan, EcoCanada, and she will do everything that we can to resolve the issue that you're having. If you have any questions about the presentation or about today's topic, you can submit these through the question box as we're going through today's webinar, and we will have a dedicated time at the end of the session where we'll ask these questions to our expert and get all the answers that you need. If we don't have time to go through all the questions today, please don't worry. We can take away any unanswered questions, send them to Reid separately and get you an answer offline. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available to everybody who registered on demand within the next 24 hours. You will receive an email with a link to the video. And finally, here at EcoCanada, we really want to know what you think about our webinars and how we can keep improving this series. We'll send you a really short survey just after the webinar ends. Just take a couple of minutes to complete, and it's your opportunity to tell us what you thought about today's session, or if you have any comments or suggestions about future webinars. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce you to today's expert speaker, Reid Graham. Reid is a project archaeologist and has been working with Tree Time Services since 2013. He oversees archaeological surveys for forestry and aggregate projects throughout northern and central Alberta, and he has a broad background in North American archaeology, with an emphasis on the boreal and plains regions of Canada and the northwestern US. Throughout his master's degree, he focused his research and interests on a series of bison kill sites in Alberta. And currently, Reid is focusing on developing predictive models for archaeological sites using artificial intelligence and machine learning to help with long-term development and land use planning. Welcome, Reid. We're so pleased that you can join us today.
It's good to be here. There we go. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the wonderful introduction there, Hannah. Yes, I'm Reid Graham. I'm a project archaeologist at Tree Time Services. And today I'll be talking about predictive modeling in archaeology. Specifically, why do we do it? How have we done it? And what are we doing now with trying to predict archaeological sites? And I'll be focusing mostly on the advances in machine learning to predict archaeological site locations, and hopefully provide you with some ideas and insights on how you can use machine learning to manage the risks of impacting sensitive areas, even beyond archaeology. So to give some context as to who I am and why I'm using machine learning, so with Tree Time Services, we're a forestry service company based in Edmonton, Alberta, and we kind of have a lot of different hats at Tree Time. Primarily, we're the largest supplier of reforestation seedlings in Alberta and the second largest in Canada. We market about 50 million trees every year for reforestation and reclamation needs. But also as part of these industry services and approvals, I work in our archaeological division, where we help our different industry partners manage cultural resources that are in conflict with development footprints. So what is a cultural resource? Typically, we're looking at some type of cultural heritage that is protected under law. So there's a variety of terms and definitions for this under the different jurisdictions in Canada. So in Ontario, we have cultural heritage resources, but here in Alberta, they're called historic resources, which is a bit of a misnomer, as we can see under the Historic Resource Act in Alberta, is there's a pretty broad definition of what a historic resource is. But operationally, it's split into 4 classes. So we have paleontology, historic structures, culturally sensitive sites, and then archaeological. And so these are locations with evidence of past human activity. So this includes things like fur trade posts, abandoned homesteads, and pre-contact First Nation campsites. And that's what I'll be primarily talking about today, is the archaeological component, and specifically in Alberta. And this is because archaeological sites are one of the more difficult of the cultural resources to manage. The sites are widespread. We have over 13,000 years of history in the province. And with that, we have over 40,000 known archaeological sites. So on this map, every little triangle is a known site. Now, the majority of these are on the plains and the parkland in the southern half of the province. And up till about 15 years ago, we really didn't know much about what was going on in the northern half of the province in the boreal forest. But since Archaeological Survey of Forestry Developments was initiated in about 2001, over 3,000 new sites have been identified throughout northern Alberta, and these are the ones that are marked in blue. Another big contributor to our knowledge of archaeological sites in the province is the oil sands, which are marked in red and in and around Fort McMurray. So between these two industries, over 5,000 new sites have been discovered over the past 20 years. So this means that archaeological sites have become an increasingly important issue for anyone planning development in the boreal forest. And this is especially true for forestry companies who are managing large land bases, but also any sort of linear development like pipelines or transmission lines. Archaeological sites are also very difficult to manage because how likely these sites are to be impacted by any development operations. Things like fossils generally are deeply buried or set into the bedrock, and old buildings stand out on the landscape, but most archaeological sites are buried just under the surface. And in the boreal forest, they typically occur within the first 10 to 30 centimeters. So this means equipment like bulldozers can very easily disturb an archaeological site without even noticing. This becomes an even bigger issue when we consider that archaeological sites are a non-renewable resource. Nobody is making new 10,000-year-old sites in Alberta. So once the site is disturbed, we lose that important scientific information that we can get from the context in which we find the artifact. These are the things that can help identify who was living at the site and when it occurred. But we also lose the integrity of the site. So beyond the scientific value, many archaeological sites have a deeper cultural value for the communities that are connected to them. So identifying where these sites are becomes an important process in the long-term planning of any development type that's happening in our country. So how does the average person go about finding where archaeological sites are? How do you anticipate conflict between a site and the development footprint? So in most jurisdictions, the location of archaeological sites is confidential. The government doesn't want the general public to know where to find the sites, and this is mainly due to the fears that they're going to be looted. So there's a couple different mechanisms that are used to communicate where these sites roughly are without giving away the precise location. So in Alberta, we use something that's called the Public Listing of Historic Resource Values. And this is what you can see on the maps here. And this is basically a flag placed on a legal land location that there is an archaeological site or the potential for an archaeological site. So each square here is a land parcel with an HRV or historic resource value. And it works to roughly identify where the sites are, but as you can see, it's very, very coarse. So this is an example of an area which is near Deer Mountain and the Grizzly Ridge, roughly about 3 hours northwest of Edmonton, Alberta. So we have on this ridge a very unusual concentration of sites on the slopes of the Deer Mountain. It's home to a unique source of tool stones known as Grizzly Ridge Opal. This glassy black and white stone is only found on this mountain and was heavily used while making stone tools in the area. Also in this area, we have a very deep history as we have found spearheads that are dating back to about 10,000 years ago in the Swan Hills. So we have a high concentration of significant sites in the area, but as you can see, the sites themselves are relatively small and they tend to fall along the edges of streams and landforms. So the sites here are the yellow polygon, and then the gray squares show these legal subdivisions that have the historic resource value flag. So if you look at this, there's actually lots of room around these sites to operate, but the listing doesn't help you to avoid the sites, it just lets you know there might be overlap. The other big issue with trying to protect archaeological sites is that we don't know where the majority of sites are. This is important from a regulatory and management standpoint because we can't protect a resource if we don't know where it is. So there's been a long history of trying to predict where archaeological sites are, stretching back into the 70s and 80s, and there's been a lot of tools that archaeologists have used to identify where new sites may be. Predominantly, what we're trying to do is identify the spatial patterns in the distribution of sites in an area and make inferences based on those assumptions. So you start with a conceptual model. And using the example of pre-contact First Nation sites, you start with, what do you think an archaeological site looks like? So for example, we tend to find archaeological sites near water. So looking in areas near water, we should find more sites. And also, people in the past tended to camp at similar spots that we would like to. So ancient campsites should be located in places we would like to camp. So high, dry places next to fresh water. So by using these assumptions, an experienced archaeologist can look at a map in an area and make judgments on where they think archaeological sites may be. And this works if we're looking at a small area, but this manual classification becomes time-consuming as we increase our scope. And it's also not very good science, as it relies mostly on intuition, and you run into problems whether it's an experienced or an inexperienced archaeologist trying to identify where sites are. Whether you're more familiar with where sites are in the Great Plains, as opposed to the boreal forest, there's different regional patterns you need to account for. So this is where predictive modeling comes into play. So these are a suite of methods and tools used to make statistical inferences on where archaeological sites are most likely to be found in the landscape. So we take our conceptual model, our ideal of what an archaeological site looks like. Or if we're looking at different fields in biology, what kind of environment do caribou live in? What kind of environment does a certain tree species exist in? Then we try to quantify these variables that make up our conceptual model. So we have ecological and topographical variables, the physical characteristics of the landscape, and we try to combine them to predict where sites are. So in archaeology, judgmental weighting or rule-based modeling was widely used in the 80s and 90s. So in terms of how these work, judgmental weighting, these are simple formulas to make your predictions. So A plus B times C equals B. Then if you're doing rule-based modeling, this is a series of if-then statements to make your model. So if I'm within X distance from water, then the area is high potential. If slope is higher than 40 degrees, then the area is low potential. While these early models were able to predict where some archaeological sites were, there was a lot of problems with these methodologies. One of the chief ones is that you would just change the formulas until you got something that you liked. So this means that the models were only based on your own assumptions, and they tended to only identify what we already knew. It's circular reasoning. This is where I think sites are. I found sites there, therefore I'm right about where sites are. It also means two different archaeologists will come up with two different models. And if you make a bad assumption from the beginning, there's going to be systemic errors all the way through the entire process, and you end up with a bad model that you think is good. It also makes it very difficult to identify new patterns using these methods because you're only finding what you already know about because you're mimicking what you're already thinking. Moving on to the late 90s and 2000s, we moved into more advanced methodology that involved regression equations like principal component analysis or different types of multivariate statistics. And these are forms of exploratory data analysis. Basically, you plot the relationship between the variables in order to determine where other likely locations would be. And this is an improvement because you're actually using the archaeological sites to make predictions instead of just what you think the sites should look like. And we're moving towards more replicable and testable science and seeing overall improvements in our ability to predict where sites are. One of the best examples of this is the Minnesota model. This is a statewide archaeological predictive model developed by the Minnesota Department of Transportation to help avoid impacts to archaeological sites. The development of this occurred between 95 and 98 with about 3 separate stages of development, and actually just completed a 4th stage in 2019. From the initial phases of the model, approximately 22% of the total state area was predicted as high potential for archaeological sites. Within this 22%, they're able to predict where 85% of all the known sites were. So using these regression equations, we're moving towards more effective and accurate models. However, this approach is costly and time-consuming. The Minnesota model cost about $4.5 million to develop in the first 3 phases. However, it's been estimated that by using this predictive model, the state saved about $3 million a year by avoiding the cost of mitigating the impact to archaeological sites. So the project is successful as in it helped protect archaeological sites and it saved the state money. But a study of the scale isn't feasible for most people. And this project also suffered from inaccuracies in terms of the data on where sites are and for the development of the variables. for what was available at the time. Fortunately, since the relative early application of these regression equations in the development of large models like the Minnesota model, there's been widespread progression in the field of predictive modeling. Firstly, the computing power has become more advanced and far cheaper than it ever was before. And also over the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen the widespread collection of LiDAR and other remote sensing data. So with this, we're able to see the landscape in a way we never could before. And it provides a wealth of information that can be mined and applied to any number of problems. And there's also been improvements to the statistical approaches to predictive modeling. And this is focused mainly in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And machine learning is a vast field, but the tools we're using and looking at today largely come from other fields in like biology with the concept of eco-niche modeling and species distribution modeling. So by using these methods and advances, we've been able to produce highly precise models that can accurately predict where pre-contact archaeological sites are. And to show how this works, I'll be talking about one of the artificial intelligence machine learning algorithms that we have used, which is called a support vector machine. And I'm going to use an example of a model we developed for sundry forest products in the foothills west of Rocky Mountain House. So what is a support vector machine? Basically, it's a supervised learning algorithm for classification and regression analysis. So let's break that down. What does that mean? We're doing supervised learning. We're telling the AI what the categories are that we are interested in. And this is opposed to unsupervised learning, where we don't tell it the categories and it sorts the data itself. So in this case, we're providing the categories as to whether or not a location has archaeological deposits. So if you look at the chart in the top left, that would be the black dot. And then we also tell it the locations that don't have archaeological deposits. That would be the white dot. Our X and Y axes on these plots would be our variables, our ecological and topographical characteristics at each location. So using this supervised learning, the AI teaches itself how to classify new data points. And it uses something called the maximum margin hyperplane to separate the data. This is basically a line that follows the maximum distance between two types of data classes. So that's that red and dashed line. They're showing the hyperplane in this theoretical data set. So if a new data point lands on the right, the AI would predict it would be a black dot. If it lands on the left, the AI would predict it would be a white dot, which is great in similar linear relationships, but this becomes more complicated with real-world data, again, especially with archaeological data sets. So the bottom chart here is showing real archaeological site data from that foothills region west of Rocky Mountain House, plotted against random locations on the landscape. And these are our sites and non-sites. So if we compare slope to proximity to water, these are two variables that are commonly used when evaluating potential. You can see there's a relationship where archaeological sites are usually close to water and on areas of low slope. However, there's a lot of noise on this chart and overlap. We can see the clustering, but we can't easily separate it out from random locations on the landscape. So to improve this, we provide the AI with more variables to consider. And each variable we add to this plot adds an additional axis. So here we have an X and a Y, but we can add a Z and throw it as a three-dimensional plot. We can also go in the fourth dimension, the nth dimension, and we can maybe represent our data we can graphically understand. What about the 6th, the 8th, the 40th? At this point, we can't even begin to wrap our heads around these concepts of space, but the AI can. There's no limit to the number of axes we can provide the AI. It's able to think and analyze the data in these dimensions that we can't even comprehend and find the patterns to draw that hyperplane. So with our models, we typically start with about 30 to 40 different variables, and each of these variables is used to separate the sites and non-sites using that hyperplane. So this is what our training data would look like. This is a region known as Lift Creek. It's a high elevation plateau with a large glacial meltwater channel running east-west through the landform. And there's a lot of archaeological sites in this area as we think the channel is being used as a travel corridor to move east to west through the area. So on this map, the locations that are red are locations with archaeological deposits. And if we look at the blue, those are the randomly generated locations of the landscape. So these are the locations the AI compares against the sites in order to draw that hyperplane, the line dividing the two categories. The second type of input we need are the variables. So these are our different types of ecological topographical characteristics that can be represented in numerical form, in this case raster data. So I already talked about slope and distance to water, but there's different ways to represent the landscape. There's different types of slope classification, like slope curvature. Like, is a slope concave or convex? We can look at the relative elevation of a location and ask questions of, am I higher or lower than my surroundings? What about at 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters? We can also classify the landscape by landforms, whether it's a ridge, a valley, a depression, or slope. And moving beyond just simple proximity to water, we can break apart the types of water and ask ourselves, how far are we from major rivers and lakes, different sizes of the lakes, water bodies with names. We can look at Strahler and Horton stream ordering and get at questions of stream significance. So we provide the AI with all of these different variables, and it looks at that hyperplane it created from the training set and sorts each location, in this case, each 10 meter by 10 meter area on the landscape, and gives a prediction of how likely that location is an archaeological site. So we've taken our training set, taught the AI what archaeological site looks like, and have given it variables and asked it to make predictions. But that's only the first part of the process. We need to test our model, evaluate its performance, and this is equally as important. So we do this by calculating the number of sites that the model predicts at different thresholds, and this is known as the gain statistic. Because we just can't say that it's 60% accurate or 100% accurate. We need to consider how much surface area the model is considering to be high potential. We can have a model that identifies 100% of the sites, but it isn't very useful if it covers 90% of the world. So we want high accuracy and low surface coverage. So for comparison, that Minnesota model had 85% accuracy while covering 22% of the state. And the current BC standards for archaeological predictive modeling require 70% accuracy within 10% of the land base. So when we're going through our models, we don't add all the 40 variables at once, as combinations of certain variables may actually degrade model performance. So we try different iterations of the variables with the training set. And we look at the performance of a single run, and then, okay, let's try a different combination. And once we get to about 10 to 20 different good models, we use what's called a genetic breeder. And it's called a genetic breeder because only the fittest survive. In this case, only the variables that help predict the most sites. So if slope and water and landform classification have high performance, let's try removing slope and see if it improves performance. If it doesn't, then let's add topographic roughness. Does that improve it? Yes. So it goes through, but this whole process is automated. And it keeps repeating in order to reduce that coverage and to improve the accuracy. And this is outside human intervention. We're using the raw computing power of the AI to identify these spatial patterns in the distribution of sites. I'm not telling the AI what variables best predict sites and how to weight them. The AI is using natural selection and deciding for itself what works best. So this process is repeated until model performance plateaus and we aren't able to get any more increases in accuracy with our variables. So with those earlier judgmental or rule-based modeling, we might run 5 to 10 different iterations. With the model made for Century Forest products, we ran about 500 different iterations before we arrived at the final model. So the end product, after all this processing, is an archaeological predictive model that has a high accuracy and high precision, but very low coverage. The AI selected about 10 variables, and with these variables, it was able to predict 89% of the sites, while only covering about 4% of the land base. As you can see, this is a vast improvement over the results of even standard regression equations like the Minnesota model, and a fraction of the time, where this might take a month or two of work versus years of processing. So that was an example of how the AI performed in one region, which was focused on predicting archaeological sites, pre-contact archaeological sites, but that's a very broad 13,000-year time period. There's been changes to the modern environment and topography that aren't obvious on the surface. This has been a major criticism and problem in the past with archaeological predictive modeling. So are we able to adapt this to different areas and address different research questions? So we approach this with what is my second case study here in the Lesser Slave Lake region, where we can see evidence of ancient shorelines high in the Swan Hills. Go back 11,000 years ago, and the glacial ice front has retreated from the Swan Hills up to about the high level region. And what has happened is it's dammed up the Peace River, which has flooded a huge area that extends south into the Lesser Slave Lake Basin and drains into the Athabasca River. Lesser Slave Lake is now 25 meters higher than it is today, which means all the lowlands around the lake would be underwater. The First Nations have been living in this area south of the ice sheet in North America for at least 3,000 years at this point. And the environment that they would have found when they first visited this lake would have been completely different from what we see today. And we can see this from these staggered ancient shorelines that formed high on the surrounding hills. However, these landforms are far from modern sources of water, so generally would be considered low potential. So how do we address this? Where would archaeological sites be located? We don't have any sites that date to this period in the Slave Lake region, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. So we approach this problem using the assumption that people would have camped on similar landforms near large bodies of water. So we taught the AI what lakeshore pre-contact sites looked like using the modern landscape, and then created a predictive model. Then we looked into what the different glacial lake levels were and then flooded the water up to those elevations. And we showed the AI these different levels, and it was able to make predictions based on those ancient shorelines. So the result is a map showing where people likely would have settled during the early Holocene. This is an area just east of Slave Lake around Mitsu Lake, and the purple and yellow show areas predicted to have sites based on the modern landscape, and the orange show areas predicted to have sites based on these ancient shorelines. So now we have a tool that we can use to find these early sites. We can evaluate and choose sampling locations with better certainty, whereas before it'd be like throwing darts blindly at a map. The last case study I'm going to talk about today is the Matthias Research Ranch. This is a property that was donated by the Matthias family to the University of Alberta in order to help protect the unbroken native grasslands that cover the property. Professors at the U of A have been working with the ranch in order to identify and help manage a number of archaeological sites that have been found on the property. So the ranch sits between the Red Deer River to the north and Metzwin Creek to the south. But most of the land in between is gently rolling sand dunes with small interdunal wetlands. And the ranch is home to a number of different types of sites, including bison kill sites, butchering campsites, teepee rings, medicine wheels. We have a fairly rich archaeological record in the area. There's some sort of hotspot of past activity. So using these same methods in the boreal forest, we trained the AI using local archaeological sites, then provided about 30 different variables that we thought would help predict where sites are. And then after about 300 model runs, we ended up with a predictive model that was able to predict where 90% of the archaeological sites were while covering about 6% of the land base. So the AI was actually able to pick out all these terraced edges on the Red Deer River and isolate the landforms that these teepee rings and medicine wheels were sitting on. And as part of this project, we went out with some university students from the University of Alberta to test the predictions. And we ended up finding 8 new archaeological sites just over 3 days using this model. So we can see that it doesn't really matter where we apply this methodology. The strength lies in the ability of the AI to recognize patterns in very complex data and use this to delineate areas of high potential. And this will only get better as the ability of the AI machine learning algorithms improve and as we get access to higher quality data. And in this situation, it's able to provide this to the university as a way to help protect historic resources on the ranch. So, in conclusion, I feel that machine learning is the future of predictive modeling. Using these methods, we're able to predict where archaeological sites are with far more accuracy and precision than we ever could before. And these methods have easily outstripped the older judgmental and rule-based modeling, as well as the earlier statistical models that use coarser data and simple regression formulas. We can see new patterns in past human activities, discover new archaeological sites, and the process is scientifically valid and testable, which is much better than the subjective nature of older methods of predictive modeling or manual judgment screening. But it's not just the academic interest, but there's serious applications of this for industry. We're able to anticipate conflicts with archaeological sites early in the project planning for development. And the methods can be applied to any region or data set, where the older approaches were restricted to local areas or constrained by the archaeologist's own knowledge and experience. And it's also customizable. We're able to explore unique questions and create predictive models that address individual concerns and not just blanket approaches. So I feel the question is not whether or not machine learning works, but how do we best apply it to minimize impact to our heritage? The technology is here. how can we use it? So I'd like to thank everybody for listening today. And if you want to learn more about archaeology in Alberta, here's a few links to Alberta Culture and Tourism, the Archaeological Society of Alberta, as well as our Tree Time blog and information. So thank you for listening.
Wow, thank you, Reid. Thanks for that fantastic presentation. It's so great to hear about the advances in modelling and the positive impacts that's having on how we protect and predict where these historic sites are. So thank you so much for being our guest speaker today. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Vanessa because we now have some time to have questions from you guys in the audience. So on your dashboard on the side, there's a chat or a questions function. Please submit your questions to Vanessa, and we have some time now just to pick Reid's brain and find out a little bit more. So I'm going to hand over to Vanessa.
Thank you, Reid, for that presentation. It's amazing to hear how machine learning is improving how we predict where historical sites are. We have a question here, we have a couple actually. The first one is, will there always be a place for humans in this industry, such as checking data and verifying models?
Yeah, so AI computers, they're really, really good at predictions. What they're really bad at is judgment. And so you always need that human component while you're doing this to make that judgment on, like, is this valid or is this AI out to lunch? Because the AI is only as smart as the data you provide it. And I commonly say, garbage in, garbage out. If you've got bad data going in, you're going to get a bad result coming out the other end. And you need to be able to evaluate what you're doing and see if, like, the results are actually valid. So there's always going to be a place for that human judgment to decide if the AI is making the right decision. And we also need to go out and evaluate this stuff in the field. It's not good enough just to do all the desktop work and sit in our office and say, yes, it's perfect. We need to, get boots on the ground and test these predictive models. And that's something you see kind of across all industries in terms of trying to apply predictive models in different fields like biology or even soil sciences, evaluating performance of these predictions.
Okay, awesome. Another question here is, are you using an established software to apply the machine learning algorithm?
Yeah, we are. We're using mostly open source software. So it's a combination of software like QGIS, GRASS, a few different things, LibSVN. But there's a lot of open source softwares out there. I talked about one specific algorithm, but the way this field's going, they're moving towards just like, which algorithm is the best, to what's called ensemble modeling, which is where you take a problem and you apply a dozen different types of machine learning algorithms to it, and then you combine them all at the end. And so, yeah, if you do even just a quick Google search, there's a lot of open source software that are free to use. There's one called Open Modeler, a few different types of different things. So the one we're using specifically is a combination of a few different open source softwares along with some coding we've done to automate it. But there's a lot of stuff out there that's just free to use. I think Google even has an online course you can take on predictive modeling and their own algorithms you can learn how to use. So there's definitely a lot of resources out there for you.
All right. Another question here is, can you recommend some literature references highlighting this research?
Cut out right at the end there. Literature references for?
Just highlighting this research around the improvements, developments of machine learning, I think. And you don't need to do it all now. If you wanted, we can. If you have a think about it, and we can always send that out to our listeners today.
The problem is that I've kind of run into is like you start looking around for information on predictive modeling, and what you'll find is it's a huge field, and you really need to know what your question is and what algorithm you need to apply it for. So like there's a lot of different applications that aren't spatially focused, and what I'm doing is spatially focused. So you always hear about like people using neural networks and teaching it how to like write new Harry Potter books and stuff. And so you'll get into that aspect of it, and like that's also predictive modeling and machine learning and all that stuff. So there isn't like a one-stop shop for like in terms of literature to review. But if you just go and find some of these open source softwares like Open Modeler or Maxent and different things like that, and you just start playing around with it and learning how to do it, you'll get down that rabbit hole and like just reading the technical manuals on this stuff. I mean, I like it, but it's not always everyone's cup of tea to read technical manuals. So,
One more question here. Do you have any insight into what's next for machine learning?
from what I've seen, it's the ensemble learning, so not just using one algorithm, but combining dozens of them to get a better result. And also the way it's moving is automation. So they've already started this with weather prediction. So that whole system is completely automated. It's taking from all the different weather stations around Canada. It's feeding into the machine learning. It's making predictions, and then it's evaluating whether it was right or not based on like the actual rain or temperature of that day, how it actually turned out, and then it's feeding back into that cell. So that's all a closed loop. Like it's kind of outside human intervention. There's still that judgment going into it, but I think that's the way a lot of this is going. It's the way I'd love to go, because it saves me a lot of time if I could just automate this process, and then I just give it more data at the beginning, and it just goes through and makes all the changes itself. So I think that's the direction we're going to go, is more automation in terms of this process. Because the big difference between like the machine learning and the AI and the earlier regression equation is more just the automation and letting the computer take over more of the work. The underlying math is basically the same. It's just we're taking out the manual input of the human at the computer, typing in the coding and going through that process.
Okay. One more question here. Can the predictive modeling be scaled to smaller size areas, specifically short versus long linear corridors for utilities?
It can be. The big problem becomes getting enough input data to properly train it. So a lot like the Prometheus model that I made up takes about 10 minutes to drive north-south. It's a relatively small area. There's a lot of sites in there that we could use. When you get smaller and smaller areas, it's harder to give the AI enough data to effectively train it. So what you tend to do is go out bigger and gather more information and kind of use that to make inferences on what's on the inside. And that's kind of also the approach if you're working in an area that we don't know where any archaeological sites are. You expand your search area and give the AI kind of sites on the periphery that are on similar sort of landscapes. And then it kind of fills in the gaps in terms of what it thinks where archaeological sites are going to be. So scaling down is a little bit harder, but on the plus side, it doesn't really change the processing time. So just because computers have become way faster and more advanced. So if you're looking at a smaller area, even if you have to expand your scope, it doesn't really make a huge difference in terms of how long it takes to process. It's just taking more data in to kind of look at that smaller area.
Okay, that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you so much for your answers, Reid.
No, thanks for having me.
Great. Just before we go, I just want to take a couple of minutes just to talk briefly about some of EcoCanada's services and resources that can help you in your environmental career. So EcoCanada is a not-for-profit organisation based out of Calgary, Alberta, and we have over 25 years' experience developing resources to support environmental professionals. And just on the screen now is our career arch, and it just shows all the areas where EcoCanada can influence your career, no matter what stage you're at. So we have lots of different programs and services targeted to different levels of professionals. So university accreditation, our Indigenous training programs there, which is all based for kind of junior individuals. We also have wage funding, which is open at the moment, where employers can receive up to $15,000 to part fund the wage of a new full-time employee. We've got lots of information on our website. Again, that's targeted at getting people in the sector and getting them to start developing the skills and experience that they need. But we also work with lots of mid-level, senior, retired professionals. We have our flagship program, which is our certification membership program, which is Canada's only environmental professional designation, and gives you that recognition for your skills and experience. And then we have emeritus members and people that sit on advisory committees. So we have lots of information on our website, www.eco.ca, where you can sign up to our newsletter and find out more. And this last slide is just some information about us. So we have a huge network all across Canada where we have over 3,000 members. We have 75,000 email subscribers. and we've distributed more than $40 million in wage funding support to employers and to participants. So please do check out our website, and I just want to say a big thank you again to Reid for joining us today and being our technical expert. It was fantastic to hear about the work that you're doing. I wish you the best of luck in the future, and thank you everybody for dialing in, and I hope to see you all again on a future webinar. Thank you very much everybody, and have a good day.